All right, guys, how are you doing? I know it's a bit late, and it's going to be a bit complicated, but I hope it will be interesting. So I wanted to do something a bit different today. I'm not going to teach you any new technology, any tips and tricks, or any libraries. Actually, what we're going to do is take a trip back to the past, way many years ago, back to the year of 2014. Yes? I can hardly remember. I was this small and like a big head of hair, but not really. But what I did in 2014 was work with Angular 1. And back then, it was just Angular, right? We had Angular 1, Angular 1.1, I think, Angular 1.2. I don't remember the versions. And until this day, a lot of people, and I've seen from Ilya's question before, use Angular at work. And surprisingly, not a lot of people actually know how Angular works or how simple it is under the hood. So we all know about all the digest loop and the two-way binding magic, but I don't know if any of you have actually tried to look at the code or figure out what's happening there, like how this thing works. So we'll try to do today something a bit unusual. We'll just build up Angular from scratch. Nothing. No Angular code, no jQuery, plain old JavaScript, like the good old days of 2014. So a few words about me. I've been developing for quite a long time. I started in the Army, in Israeli Army. I worked in the Air Force. I was doing something that's today called DevOps. Back then, it was, I don't know, system or just running servers. Did that for 4 years. Then I switched to doing embedded development and Linux kernel drivers. Got bored of that. I switched to doing servers with Ruby on Rails. Got bored of that. I switched to doing JavaScript with Angular and React. And today is pretty much the end of that 4-year stint. So I don't know if you have any good ideas for me to do in the next 4 years. I go 4. Okay. No, not JavaScript. It has to be really different. I don't know, something crazy. Scala. You have to think farther away. The next Scala. I want virtual reality embedded in, I don't know, in mice brains, programming neurons. So these days, as Kirill said, I'm based in Israel. Back there, I run the AngularJS group, the local there, which is pretty big, even compared to the New York one. The React.js group as well. And we have 2 conferences that's running in Israel. One is an Angular conference. It's a full-day conference, a lot of great speakers from everywhere, including here from New York. We had, I think, 1 or 2 speakers last year from there. And if anyone wants to visit the Holy Land and get to know a bit more about Angular, it's like a perfect opportunity, a trip, vacation, and work. And the main reason I'm here these days is just trying to figure out what's happening here in New York. Like, what kind of technology you guys are using, how much Angular 2 there is, or 4 or 5, I don't know what's happening now. React, Vue.js, or whatever. So if anyone likes technology, just want to chat, I would love to do it, just to know what's happening here. All right, I'm going to skip this, and let's go into the code, because today we're going to be doing live coding, and a lot of it. So I created a very simple application, and so you know I'm not lying, and I'm going to show you all the files inside. So I got git ignore, which is not very exciting. I got the license, which we're not going to read now, but it's important. And I got some README extractions, because this code is on GitHub, so you can later download if you want to play with it. So basically, we have 3 files that interest us. So I got the index.js file, which has, I'm used to having the screen behind me, which has basically nothing, right? We have a title, and we include 2 JavaScript files. And when I say AngularJS, it's not real AngularJS. It's this file, which is empty, right? And the index.js itself is also empty. So we have 0 JavaScript now. And let's make a small test, console log, hello, AngularNYC. Perfect. So we're started, right? So we got the ball running. So I want to talk about the basic Angular like we know it. I think the most common and interesting directive back in Angular is, what's the most common directive and the most exciting one, the one you learn first? ng, what, no? ng model. Ng bind is not exciting because nothing happens when you put it. But ng model, ng what? ng app. No ng app here. It's just too complicated. going to do something really simple. When I say simple, we're going to put an input here and call ngModel, let's say, age. And since we want to be complicated, we're going to get another one, let's say, gender. So what will happen now? What do you think? Once I refresh and write some stuff here, what will happen? Nothing, of course. There's no reason for anything to happen. I just added an attribute on the div. But I want a real Angular here. So somehow I need to catch that directive declaration. I'm not going to build the whole model system and in dynamic injection and dependency injection and all the other stuff. I'm going to try it super easy, super simple. The way I want to declare directive is just say directive, say what kind of directive I want. Let's say ngModel, and give it something that's similar to the controller we know from directives. Basically, a function that gets the element that we found. And let's say console log found ngModel and print the element. So of course, nothing will work now because directive doesn't exist. So let's create it. Const directive is just a plain function, right? So far, it's a function that gets two parameters. The first one is the name of the directive, and the second one is the controller. So if you think about it, all this function really does is go over our body, all of the elements in the body, and just tries to find any element that has the ngModel attribute on it. Right? That's all. We can do it using simple JavaScript document query selector all. And how can I find all the DOM elements that have a specific attribute? Square brackets, right? I can do something like this, ngModel, right? This is going to find all the elements that have an attribute, of this attribute on them. And then for each of them, for each, we'll just do lm and call the controller and pass the element to it. That's all. By the way, I'm going to be using ES6 or ES 2015-16. If you don't know it yet, shame on you. Go home and study. But otherwise, I hope it's clear. So let's see what happens now. And things appear to be working, right? So we found both our mod inputs, right? The first one and the second one. We get the controller running for them, so we can start building real directives. I just want to make another change to the directive, because here inside the ngModel, we have the age and gender, right? So we want to distinguish between the two somehow. So I'm going to make life a bit easier for people writing directives. And they're not only going to get the element, they're also going to get the key, right? The age of a gender, like whatever the ngModel maps to. So that's pretty easy here. We just go to the element, go to the attributes, ngModel, and value. So now we can say found ngModel plus key. Let's see. Perfect. Found ngModel age and found ngModel gender. One last thing, I'm still writing ngModel here. So this directive thing is not really generic. Luckily, I already have a name passed over, so I can just make this dynamic name, and the same here. Perfect. Now we can do any directive we want. By the way, if you have any questions, just raise your hand, and depending on the time, we'll see what we can do about it. All right, perfect. Something is already running. I think it's time to think about what the ngModel directive actually does. And in the end, it's a very simple directive. All ngModel does, right, is listen to input events on my input element and create inside the scope under the same key the value. So let's say if I write something here in my age input, I would expect the scope to have a key age with the value 1 to 1, 3, 2, 1, 2. But before we start, we have to think about the scope. So in the linear Angular, scope is quite complicated, right? We have isolated scopes, scope inheritance. I'm going to jump all that, and for now, we'll just speak about something like the root scope, or basically just a global variable holding all the information we want in our app. Later on, if we want, we can make the directive function create a dynamic scope every time. Complicated, but doable. All right, so I got the scope. Now I want to listen to my element and see every time there's a chance. So luckily, HTML5 has this nifty feature. I can do on input, and give it a function. Now this function is going to run every time I change something in my input change. So let's give it a try. And OK, perfect. We see the change, but we don't see the value. And that's pretty easy also. All we can do is element value. And this should give us the value of the input. Excellent. So we can listen to changes on the input. We see the value. Now we just have to stick it somehow inside the scope, which is plain JavaScript scope at the place of key, right, which is name or gender, and put lm value there. So it might be working, it might not be working, I don't know, but let's just print out the scope, and perfect, right? The scope is updated. So I'm pretty much done with ng model, kind of. So like half the work is done. So I want to jump to something more interesting. So someone yelled out of a crowd, ngbind, right? And ngbind is something like this. I want to show age to be equal age, right? This is basically ngbind. Angular translates this to ngbind. We're not going to try to make inline translation of curly braces. We'll just do it the old-fashioned way. Span ngbind age, and let's say gender ngbind gender. All right. So I'm going to jump back to the code, and let's create the ngbind directive. Directive ngbind elements and key, and let's see if this works. Console log got bind on key. Should work. Should work. Perfect. So we found the binding as well. But when we go to implement it, we have a new problem. So the whole idea behind ngbind is to update the value inside the element every time the value in scope changes. How can we know if something in the scope changed? Like, this is quite a tricky question because it's really hard. My scope now is a plain JavaScript object, so there are some ways to set up observers on it. In real Angular, it's more complicated because you might have isolated scopes and scopes that are dependent on other scopes. Getter setters also might be complicated if you have nested trees of scopes. It can get pretty complex. So the guys at Angular found a solution. And their solution sounds a bit brute force. And they just said, you know what? Every time you change the scope, you tell us. We're not going to guess. Every time you change the scope, digest. That's all digest does. It tells Angular, I changed the scope. I won't tell you what I changed, which scope, when, why, how. I just made a change. And we as developers will always have to call on this digest. If it's an AJAX request, an input, timeout, anything, it's up to us to call digest. So I'm going to add digest here, digest. And all it will do now is just call console log, and let's print the scope. Right, so every time there's a change, we print the scope. Right, so we're getting closer. So now I know to get events about the change in the scope, right? But how can I get a callback in the ngbind? So like I want to register on a callback, and every time something changes in the scope, I want to get a notification about it. So there is another function in Angular for it, and it's called watch, right? What basically watch does is me asking Angular, tell me about any changes that happen to the scope. And we're going to start with something, sorry, the question? I'm going to start with something really easy. We're just going to pass it a callback, right? Something like this. You know what, I'm not even going to put it inside the ngbind. I'm going to put it outside. Watch. Every time there's a change, console log, age is scope age. And let's say another watch. Every time there's a change, gender is scope gender. So how does the scope function looks like? Watch. It gets a callback, and it does some magic. So what kind of magic do I need to do in watch to make sure that the callback is invoked every time the scope changes? So that's like maybe the trickiest part there is. The watch function itself is going to get called only 2 times, right? This is where we call it, on the bottom here. But the callback was going to be called a lot of times, basically every time we have a change in the input. So what we're going to do is just save all these callbacks and call them later on every time we have a change. Let's say const watches, just get an array, and watches push callback. So now every time someone calls $watch, we just take the callback, save it on the side, and hopefully one day someone will call those callbacks and tell us about the difference. And luckily we have someone to do that, right? They just knows that something changed. So all we can do here is just go to watches, for each watch, call the callback. All right, let's give it a try. Now every time I change something, right? Every time I write something in the input, the callback gets called from the input. I update the scope, call digest, and digest tells everyone that something has changed. So my age is going to be 1, 2, and my gender is going to be cat. It's not really a gender, but work with me. But looks like everything is working, right? So we have kind of a change detection and some sort of binding. So I'm going to use this amazing new watch functionality to basically make ngbind work. So what we're going to do is something like it. Watch, and every time the scope changes, just go to the element, and let's update the inner text of the element to whatever it's sitting in the scope under the age or gender key. So to make this nicer, I also want to do it the first time we run, right? Even before we start the whole digest loop, even when the ngbind loads, maybe you already have something in the scope. So I want to run this once outside. And since we like clean code, we'll do something like this. Update is a function that does this. We're going to call update once when the directive loads. And also, we're going to pass update as we call back to watch. So now every time there's a change in scope, update gets called and updates the element. Let's try. And OK, perfect. Something is working there. There's one small bug here. We get all these undefined messages. And that's because we don't initiate the scope in any way, right? So we can take exactly the same code from here and do scope key on the first run equals to element value. And if nothing is inside the element, just put an empty string inside of it. And I'm going to use the same way like I did in ngModel and in ngBind. Create an update method that does all this, which is basically these 2 lines, right? Update the scope and call digest, and put it inside on input, and call it myself once. Oh, I forgot to add the empty value. All right, let's try. Hopefully it's working now. So the CSS obviously is ugly, but the functionality looks OK. Let me put some kind of BR or something here because it's on div. All right. Make it a bit prettier. OK, so far so good. We have some kind of binding. Now I have a question for you guys. What happens if I have 2 inputs with the same model? Something that we definitely can do in Angular, right? What will happen if I write 1, 2, 3 here now? Who thinks I will see the value here in the age? Who doesn't think I'll see the value? Who is too tired to raise his hand? You can raise anything else you want. So I had some guesses here. So we'll see the scope updated, of course, but the second input is not updated. Yeah, and it's going to override whatever I've had before. So we're not syncing the inputs now, which makes sense, right? If I look at ngModel now, we're listening on change events on the input, but we're not listening on change events on the scope. Someone might be changing the age, and we don't know about it. How can we know if someone changed the scope and we need to update the input? Watch. exactly what, so we'll just do watch, and every time there is a change, we'll just go to element value and put scope key inside of it. And now we have real two-way binding between everything, right? So if two inputs bound one to another, we have a regular element, which is a P or a div, I don't remember what it was, also bound to the data. We have multiple inputs updating different parts of a scope. So we already have something that's really similar to Angular. But I want to take it even one step further. I want to do something like this. How about we get a minor warning? Is a minor ng show if age is less than 18. So that's a bit complicated, right? We have to listen to changes in the scope, but suddenly we know what kind of change we want to listen to. All right, so I'm going to jump back to the code and try to write ng show. So let's take a go of it. Directive ng show. It gets an element. And now the second part is not really a key. The second part is now an expression, right? Because I can put anything I want here. So let's give it a try. Expression. So the watch is simple. Watch something. But how am I going to decide if to show or hide the element now? Like, how can I run this expression and see what's happening? So eval sounds like an option. You know what? Let's try eval. You know what? Console log, eval, expression, and console log. Let's log the expression itself, exp. We have a problem, which makes sense, right? So my expression has age inside of it, and it's not a global variable, it's not a local variable, it's just something inside of a scope. So we have to somehow create a system to get inside of it. And the way Angular solved it is they basically take this expression and parse it in JavaScript. So there's no good way to do it. At least I didn't find, and I really searched all over. The guys at Angular just parse the expression in JavaScript and run it in a special parser, which is more limited than a regular evaluation. I'm going to use something that's just try to close your eyes for a second. I created this horrible function, which is basically eval with some more eval inside of it, and evil eval. And what that does is that I can do something like this. I can say run, how did I call it? Eval scope, eval in scope. I give it an expression and the scope with all the local variables that should be inside of it. And now it should be working. If anyone wonders, the code is going to be on GitHub. It's not that ugly. It's not nice. So we can see it's working, right? Age is below, and now age is above.
Does it work?
Sorry?
It always shows it is a minor. It should hide.
No, yeah, but I didn't do it yet. I'm just looking at the prints. And to show it is a minor, we'll do element style display equals, we'll do only this part, right? If it's true, show inherit, otherwise show none. None. Right, so let's see. Is a minor, not a minor anymore. Cool, so we got expressions as well. And if you look at the ng show directive, it's so simple. Like, you guys can try it home, choose any random directive you want, except of maybe ng options. And it's like 5 minutes work to implement them. Even ng repeat and others. A bit more complicated, but really not a lot of code inside. So this thing is working, but I want to extend my application even more. I don't know if you noticed, I have a small problem with the watches. If I do something like watch, like the code we had before, watch console log, age, scope age, and gender. So every time I change one of the fields, all of my watches are running. which is fine for this application, but a real one will have, what, 100, 200, 500 watches, and each watch might be changing JavaScript, running, doing Ajax calls. Like, we can't have all the watches executing all the callbacks every time, every key press on the keyboard. So we have to find a way to say, you know what, I want to run this watch only when the age changes, right? There's no reason to run it all the time. Or only when the age changes, gender changes. So I want to change my watch directive, watch callback, to get a key and a callback. And run the callback only if there was a change on that key. So since the watch itself does nothing but saves data, I'll just change my watches array to hold objects that hold both the callback and both the key and the callback. And I'll let the digest handle the full complexity. So now when I run over watches, I don't get callbacks anymore. What I get back is this. I get a key and a callback, watch, and I have to figure if when to run the callback. So that now there are quite a few ways to do it. Most people that I try to show them this example, they say, right, so what we can do is make a copy of a scope before we change it. So we have two versions, and then compare. And every time we see a difference, we run. But what happens, let's say, during that comparison, that one of the watches also wants to change the scope. Now we have to create a third version of the whole scope. And if someone else is trying to change it as well, then the fourth one, and then make really complex and weird comparison between all the versions. Or theoretically make mistakes and just say, you know what, we think it changed, so just run it just in case. Another way to do it is not to think about it as a change on age or as a change of gender, is to say, was the watch called since, was something changed for this specific watch? So if I'm watching the key age, and I call the callback now, next time I'm going to check, I just want to verify that I didn't call this callback before there was a change to age. What I mean by that is I'm going to see what's the value scope of the value of age now, and I want to compare it to the last value we had inside the watch, something like watch last. Right? Means if we had the last here, I could just say, all right, no problem, compare it to the last, and if it's different, update watch last with whatever is sitting in the scope. So this is a bit complex. So what might happen here is we have two watches looking at age. Both of them run. Both of them compare to a previous value, which say 0. Both look at the current ones. It's 10, whatever. They run the callbacks, and the next time both of them run, they say, the previous one was 10. The last time I was called, it was 10. Now it's 10. No need to run. The only piece missing now is how do I get the initial last value? Well, since it was the watch, $watch, who pushed everything inside, we have to do it here, right? So we have to say last. And what's the left? We can just use the value, whatever value we have now, right? Scope key. So let's try this now. I'm going to change the age, and I see the age callback is running. I'm going to change the gender, and perfect. So now we're selectively running the correct watch. So let's go and fix every occurrence of $watch. ng model, we're watching the key. That's easy. ng bind, we're watching the key. That's easy. ng show, we have a problem, right? We don't have a key. We have an expression, age lower than 18. How can I watch the expression? So I know inside there is an age. So I can say, OK, let's parse the string, find all the variables, and watch them. But the expression might get a bit complicated. So it might be age with something. It might be a function like, I don't know, round age. So it'd be really hard to figure out what kind of keys I have to watch. So to solve the problem, I'm just going to go the other way. I'll say, you know what? Just give me an expression to watch. I don't want to have specific key. Give me a whole expression. I'll just watch the whole thing. Which means in my watch, I'll change this to an expression. Last. This to an expression. And how can I know what's the current value of an expression within my scope? Is there any way to know what's the value of expression age lower than 18? Hmm? What's run? What do you mean run it? How can I run it? So I can use the really ugly hack I did to evaluate the expression and get the value. So eval in scope, let's do that. Eval in scope, expression and scope. And the same here, right? So here we're also calculating the value, so we'll do it here as well. Const current is eval in scope with expression and scope. Let me change it here to expression. So if the current value is not equal to the last value is going to be the current value. All right, I hope it works now. So I got a question for you guys, another one. In ng model, I just put the key inside. Should I fix something here? Because I said the watch is no longer watching a key, it's watching an expression. But if you think about it, what is a key? It's basically a very simple expression, age. It's the variable age inside the scope. So it just backwards compatible automatically. So now when I run everything, we should have the age working and this working. And to test this theory, I'm going to go here and inside of ngbind say, you know what, show me the age times 2. And it's failing. Why is it failing? It shouldn't be failing. It's failing because we don't. Why is it failing? It's a mystery. It's a mystery. Age times 2. You want to have a break? Ta-ta-ta-ta. To what? ngbind. Scope. Eval in scope. Right. Eval in scope. Expression. And scope. Let's change this to expression. So it's clean. Perfect. We almost have a perfect Angular. So if you look at this thing, it looks like we have pretty much solid Angular going on, right? I can use expressions. I can watch expressions. We have full two-way binding. We have time. Yep. So I want to do one last thing and finally solve the biggest question of them all. I'm going to create something really weird. I'm going to watch the age expression or key, whatever, right? And every time it changes, I'm going to show you console log age. And I'm going to go and update something, watch, and update something in the scope. Scope, let's say retirement. Retirement is going to be scope age, parse int, because it's a string. Scope age plus, let's say 30 years, something like that. Makes sense. And I want to watch retirement. And every time it changes, I just want to show it. Console log, retirement, scope, retirement. Right, let's give it a try. So first of all, we have a failure here. Retirement is not inside the scope, so my special mega function is failing, and we're going to solve that by just doing a try and catch all around it. That was the easy part. But now, every time I change the age, I see the watch for age ran and outputted something, right? But I don't see the retirement watch. So let's try another number. Okay, so it is running, but somehow we're missing updates. And if you think about it, what's happening here, we have a list of watches, right? So first, when I change the age, the retirement watch runs, nothing changed, right? It's okay. The age watch runs, updates the retirement, and that's it. We're at the end of the array, so we're not doing anything. So from Angular's or whatever perspective, we're done, but not really done, because we didn't update all the elements on the screen. We didn't run all the watches correctly. So how can we fix it? So one idea might be, Sorry?
Switch them.
So we can switch them. Yes, that's one option. And I want to see if a poor developer using your framework, it's not working. Did you try moving the lines? Oh, wow, that's amazing. So every new developer that comes, like, something's not working. Did you try moving lines around the code? Maybe it will help. It's an option. Option number 2 is, let's say, so let's do something like this. Inside of my digest, how about we run digest twice? Right, so the first time it will run and the age callback will run, right? Update the retirement. The second time the retirement will notice and show itself. So let's try, and perfect, so it's working. I don't want to write it in this way because maybe every time the retirement is updated, it updates the death age, and so then we'll have to have 3 loops. So what I can do is just, you know what, let's take all this code and put it inside another function, const digest once, and just do it like this, digest once, multiple times. And if something is not working, you just tell the developer, add a few more, probably will work for you. 50-50, it will be fine.
Or move the lines.
Huh?
Or move the lines.
Or move the lines.
Double.
So I have another idea. How will we know if we need to run it once, twice, or 50 times? How can we know if we need to run digest again and again?
When there is no more updates.
How do we know there are no more updates? That's hard because I might have a scope that has 2 keys, right? But with 50 watches on the same keys, that has some very, very weird dependency. How do I know that after I ran my first digest, I need to run another one or not? Or let's say it another way. Why did I have to run it the second time?
Because another scope changed,
Right, so because in the first digest, someone changed the scope. So the only reason for me to run it again if someone changed something during my digest. How do I know if something got changed? So I don't really know because watch only tells me that something changed. But if I ran a callback, it might have changed something, right? If I didn't run this callback, definitely nothing changed. But if I ran it, something might have got called. So I'm going to do something like this. I'm going to say let changed be false, changed. And if I see that I run the callback, I'll just mark the changed to true. I'm not sure something got changed, but there is a chance that something got changed. Return changed. And now instead of running it once, twice, or 5 times, we'll just do let changed true. And while something is changed, right, put the changed to false, and then get changed equal digest. So I can remove the first side, right? So basically, as long as the change is true, we run the digest loop. Sorry, we run the digest loop. And if it tells us that something might have been changed, we run it again. And if something got changed again, we run it again until hopefully nothing is changing anymore. I have a typo there. What kind? 39. That's not a typo. I'm just testing you. Okay. So that thing is working. But let's say we have a very unfortunate developer who decided that every time the retirement changes and is really tired, he'll just update the age. Right. So I'll just get older. Parse int, scope age, I just add 5 years to myself, and hopefully I'll get retired really fast. So let's see what happens now. Something bad is happening. Something bad is happening. So our digest loop is running, and hopefully it doesn't kill my lab. Okay, stop.
You may have to close the tab and reopen it.
Okay, so I'm not going to touch it anymore. So that was not a good idea. But I can't stop developers, and I've seen things during my long and bitter career. So what we're going to do is try to limit this thing and say, you know what? Let's go to the digest and let loops be, 14, right? That's the number in Angular now? It's 10. Wasn't it 14 before? 10. Okay. So while something changed and we still have loops left, let's make loops lower, and run this again. And if not loops, console log digest loop running way, way, way too long. Perfect. So if you're wondering what the digest loop is, that's the digest loop, not the initial run on the array. It's just running over the digest again, again, and again. I don't remember the name of the property, but I remember you could change the number of digest loops you have. If you had really bad code, like it's 10, yeah, you just put it on 14, and it'll be fine. And move some code around, and everything will be magic. So I think at this point I'm going to stop because we basically built the whole Angular project here. I won't suggest. Why are you laughing? I don't know. It's Angular. Look, we have expressions. We have ng-show. I can do ng-if you want. Like, I don't know. I think it's pretty cool. Yeah, I can't change it because my retirement plan is kind of punishing me backwards. But that's all. That's the base of Angular. All this code is done on the GitHub repo. I think the most interesting part is the ugly eval in scope up there. That's the #1 reason why never to use this in any actual real application. If anyone finds a better way to do this, I would really love to hear. That's it. Guys, thank you very much.